One of the reasons that I'm here is because Street Level, in partnership with Autograph, Association of Black Photographers in London, are preparing an exhibition of the work of Maud Sulter for 2015. And we've been thinking about her work and thinking about how to introduce it to new audiences. Some of you may well have known Maud herself, but for many of you, her work may be completely new. You may see it occasionally when it's on show. It's in many national collections. So we've been thinking about giving talks, making events. We've got some events in London next year, maybe some other events in London, to try and kind of put an artist who was very well known in the 1990s and at the turn of the century back, in a sense, on the map, so that when we show her work in 2015, there'll be a little bit of, more knowledge and interest about her. So that's one of the reasons why I'm giving the talk today. And I just would also like to say that in presenting the work of an artist from the 90s, I'm very aware, especially an artist who I knew myself, I'm very aware that this is a kind of personal view. It has a lot of memory for me muddled up with it, and that I'm really, really interested to hear what you think now about this work, how you see this work today, what it makes you think about, and how we can respond and reanimate work that has come to us from sometimes some of the work that I'll show is her early work in the mid to late 80s, right up to some of her last work in around 2002, 2003. It was her last major work that she made. You can see she's born in 1960. She died, in 2008, so her life is very, very tragically cut short after a long terminal illness in which she wasn't making as much work. She was really, really active in the mid-90s, and I'll be able to show some of that incredible energy in the work. So I'd just be really interested to think about what are the legacies today of this kind of art, and how it also gives us a new way of thinking about art practice in the 90s. What I think is very interesting is her work as an artist, as a curator, as a writer, as a gallerist, and goodness knows what else. She's amazingly energetic. What that says for us today. I called the lecture Legacies because I wanted to suggest that, although it's several years since she died, that the legacy of her work, it's like a gift to us. It's something that she bestowed to us. It takes it forward, and one of the things that we're thinking about in the exhibition is this idea of what is a living archive, what is a living legacy, that we don't want to kind of wrap it up in the mausoleum of the museum, but that we want that to be something that's active, proactive. Maud wanted to change the world in which she lived, so you don't want to make her a dusty archive. You want that energy and excitement and engagement. That's why she was an artist. That's why she was a writer, to carry on. So we've got a lot to think about. So I really, really welcome your thoughts on how to do that. What did she bequeath to us? An intense engagement with the world, an intense engagement with the representation of women of color, an intense engagement with and an address to the history of European modernism. She passionately researched and believed in the idea that Black women, women of color, have long histories in Europe, and those long histories have dynamically participated in, created and changed the histories of photography, the histories of European modernism, and her practice is around a lot of those issues. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. As I said, I knew Maud, so there's a kind of personal dimension to this. I met this charismatic, challenging, warm-hearted, passionate, demanding, engaging woman in the late 1980s, and she came across as someone who had an intense, restless intelligence, a creative curiosity that wanted to think through the nature of visual representation, both in putting people in public life, that kind of political representation, but also visual representation. She was a public intellectual, I think, in every sense of that word, an artist, a curator. She curated 20 shows. I mean, that's quite an achievement in a sort of 10-year period. She's an award-winning poet. She won several awards for her poetry, and her poetry is really anthologized a lot. I spent this morning at the Scottish Poetry Library in Edinburgh, which has a fair amount of material on her as a writer. She founded Urban Fox Press because she believed that the right books weren't being published. So what do? I create a press. She called it Urban Fox, a radical press for the 1990s. Okay, the work isn't being shown, so what does she do? She creates a gallery. She created a gallery called Rich Women of Zurich. Isn't that the most wonderful title? And she opened this gallery in London's Clerkenwell district. And if you know London and you know that the London art world in the 80s moves east, it goes to Hoxton, it goes to Clerkenwell. And the only people really who were there before her, Art Angel. So she moves and she does what I think is probably one of the first pop-up shops, which is this Rich Women of Zurich. I mean, pop-up shops are now really, really common. But she's always finger on the pulse, always in advance, restless, relentlessly energetic. She's born in Glasgow. She went to London as a teenager, and she went first to London College of Fashion. And I think was only there for about 2 years, and started life really as a writer and a journalist, writing pieces for Spare Rib, doing interviews with people, doing photographs, and working with a very distinguished photographer, Ingrid Pollard. Ingrid took photographs, Maud did writing, and they set up something called the Black Women's Creativity Project. And she then began to a career as an artist. At this point, she has absolutely no training as an artist. She's not done a lot of art training. She doesn't get trained in photography till 1989, and she does a photography degree at Derby, but she starts taking photographs in the late 1980s. So it just shows a couple of her images. This is the image which is in the publicity material, and it's one of her last works, and I'll talk a little bit about it at the end. But it's kind of one of her a major signature piece, and you can see she's interested in photography, representation, question of beauty. So here she is. She's started as a writer. She takes up this career now as an artist, and she shoots to fame with a series called Sahabat in 1989. She becomes suddenly there's this new star in the firmament. She wins the British Telecom New Contemporaries Award in 1990, shortlisted for the European Photography Awards. Suddenly this woman who just got her MA has this incredible reputation. It's a series of 9. The complete 9 are in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They were purchased by 2 pioneering photography curators who were buying the work of young black artists in the 1980s and 90s. They bought the set of 9 and various others. A complete set was owned by the Scottish Arts Council, but when the Scottish Arts Council disbanded, the set was dismantled, but it means that somewhere in Scottish museums there's another set, and then various other individual works were bought by different people, different museums. And suddenly her work was being collected. It went into the Arts Council England, it went into the British Council collections. It's now today in numerous public collections. There's Scottish National Portrait Gallery has some, Scottish Parliament has some, National Portrait Gallery in London has some. So Mallory Blackman, she photographed, who many of you will know, the Children's Laureate, in a suite of photographs, portrait photographs of children's writers for children. And this is her work in the Scottish Parliament, Aquambo, 2001, in Edinburgh. Unfortunately, the Scottish Parliament work, isn't on public view. If you go to the public areas of the Scottish Parliament. You can see some work in the Scottish Parliament collections, but this one is apparently not on public view. But in the space of, I would say, about 4 or 5 years, she'd had numerous exhibitions, and her work was very quickly being acquired. She was very fated and rather stellar. Some of you will have known, as I said, some of you have seen her personally, some of you may have seen work when it's been on show in various collections. And also last year there was a really lovely exhibition curated here in Glasgow by Mother Tongue. One of the Mother Tongue curators is here, recurated an exhibition that Maud had shown at first at CCA in 1995 and then recurated. So this kind of recurating her work, also getting the works out from store, putting on the walls. The Calliope was on show at City Art Centre in September in Edinburgh. The whole series of Sahabat from the V&A was on show at the Ben-Yuri Gallery in London. So it seems this is a good time to be doing an exhibition of her work because there's a new interest from all sorts of different perspectives. So I'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of work. I'll talk a little bit about one of the major themes of her work, and I'll talk a little bit at the end about the exhibition and what we're hoping to do and the sorts of things that we hope to achieve with it. So, Maud Sulter as an artist, she was really an amazing artist. As I've suggested, she did so much different kinds of work. She did film, she did sound art, she did painting, she did drawing, she did installation as an artist, as well as working as curator and writer, and etc. She experimented a lot with lots of different media, and often she pushed this media absolutely right to the limit. So those of you who know, you know the new colour photography is coming in the 70s, really in the 80s, so lots of people like Anna Fox, for instance, doing very nice colour work. By the end of the 1980s, Maud's doing these big Cibachrome work. This is just on your left-hand side is Sahabat installed at Rochdale. They're really, really large Cibachrome. They're fantastically expensive to produce, tricky, so she'd have to get the right printer, get it all right. So and she's really pushing it to the limit. She experiments with photomontage in the 90s. She experiments with sound art installation. This is Alba, shown at Preston, and then later at CCA in Glasgow and at Omo Baths in Belfast. And this is amazing sound piece where she's got African art objects. The black and whites are rephotographs of an alchemy book in the library, Mitchell Library here in Glasgow. There's a series of portraits that you can just glimpse at the back. There's a soundtrack with Maud reading her work, some commissioned music, and the sound of a horn, a Nessun horn from Ghana. So they're really, really interesting pieces. And you know, the 1990s is the decade of installation. So of course, Maud Sulter is making installation. At the turn of the century, she comes back to Scotland and she begins a completely new direction in her career, which is portrait photography. And that's also really interesting. So this relentless creativity never settled still. She's really always experimenting. As I've said, she's a distinguished writer, curator. She was a teacher. She worked as head of print at Manchester Metropolitan. She worked as a gallery services officer, which an exhibition organizer at Rochdale. So she did an enormous range of things. And she did set up this amazing press called Urban Fox Press. And I just, in case, these books are quite hard to find now, so I'll just pass it round if you'd like to see this. And she created this book, Passion, which is such a word that was very much in her vocabulary. It meant engagement, it meant self-naming, it meant claiming a space for black women, very inspired by Fanon's idea of passionate research. And she was really, really fed up with the fact that all the books coming out on feminism and feminist art practice were about white women's practice. That Framing Feminism had this little section at the back, kind of, I can't remember what it was called, but where all the black women artists were corralled together. So she said, fine, I'm going to set up my own press, I'm going to produce my own collection. And she did, and she produced this amazing book that opened up the whole question of what is art. So it has theatre, ceramics, music, gardening, henna painting, hair plaiting, a whole range of different ideas. It's called Black Women's Creativity. So it's not just about fine art. There are essays on fine art, there are artist pages, there are discussions about the exclusions of the white art establishment. And she writes in the introduction, "It is painful to see the ignorance of exhibitions, publications, meetings that have happened, to recognize the fact that so much remains unread and unlooked at." So she just set about creating these events and books and exhibitions, and she pulled lots of things together so that threaded through the book is a series of wonderful photographs taken by Ingrid Pollard, who has the most, if you're not familiar with her work, she has a lovely website, just still very much an interesting photographer today. And she then, when Maud worked at Rochdale, she then showed these photographs in the gallery format. So she's constantly changing her audiences from book to exhibition. Then she would create an exhibition, and then she would create a set of dynamic events around it. She would network, pull people together. Just sheer drive and energy behind these events is phenomenal. So she created, for instance, this is one of her exhibitions called The Fortune Teller, in which she's one of the first people in the UK to consistently start showing artists like Lorna Simpson. So you can see Lorna Simpson's work here. Lorna Simpson was beginning to be shown in the UK, camera work in the late 1980s. And so Maud's kind of taking Lorna Simpson up. And she began to show, she was one of the first curators to really expand the showing of people like Betty Saar, Carrie Mae Weems, Andrea Serrano, people like that. You know, big, famous international artists of color who she created fora for in either exhibitions like Fortune Teller, which were highly, selective. It was Karen Knorr, Olivier Richon, and Lorna Simpson in this exhibition, or the exhibition that she created at Photogenetic here in 1995, had these amazing artists along with a lot of British artists and world artists. So she's just incredibly dynamic. And she then produced these amazing books published through Urban Fox Press that go beside the exhibitions and the debates and the discussions and the events. And they're really collections of writings, of photographs, of artist statements. So she's trying to rethink the exhibition catalogue as a dynamic space of exchange. And when Sarat Maharaj was writing at the same time about the dynamics of a migratory aesthetic, he came up with this idea of the suitcase, where everything is pressed, strapped, and squeezed into a suitcase as something that represents a kind of migratory aesthetics. And I think these books feel like these little books. They're little square books like this, not very fat, but they just burst. The contents of them really expand beyond the book. So she's incredibly dynamic and energetic. What could we say then is her legacy? How could we just sum up, just to kind of think about this before I talk about one of the themes of her work? I decided that, well, one of the key things about her work was this incredible rethinking the representation of black women. She does it in Sahabat. These are two from Sahabat. These are extraordinarily powerful works. They're portraits, they're allegories. Sahabat is a theatre of the muses, so she re-envisages the muses as these black women. The artist Lubaina Hamid is a muse of astrology. Alice Walker is the muse of comedy. Famous singer, Isaiah Maria Barnwell, is Polyhymnia, the muse of sacred song. So there are these 9 black women muses who are a kind of model, muse, sitter for the portrait, allegorical figure, really, really complex layer upon layer of levels of representation here. Her work is really steeped in allusion and reference. So there are whole sets of references that you can pull out of these works, like Alice Walker's, the bouquet of flowers might refer to In My Mother's Gardens. It might refer to the figure of Laure in Manet's Olympia. There are a lot of different possible references, and I think Maud was very, very studious and attentive to the tradition of Western art and the traditions of African art. So she begins in her work this amazing deconstruction of Western modernity, and she does this through a series of photo montage. These are amazing works. She's looking, of course, to Hannah Hoch, but she's rethinking this for now, intercutting historical images with African masks, key images of Western modernity. So that's the second thing that I think is important about her work. The third thing I think is important about her work is the question of self-portraiture. These later self-portraits, particularly Les Bijoux, offer a kind of counter-imagery of blackness and beauty. And they're very, very celebrated works at the time. They were applauded for their beauty, for their self-confidence, for the assurance, and for the kind of range of emotion that she was able to convey. I think also the other part of her legacy is, and one of the things that we are trying to explore in her work, are the crossovers between these images and some contemporary images in music culture. And that's one of the things that we're just beginning to think out, that not only is there a lot of art historical reference, but there are huge other references to popular imagery, music imagery, lots of crossovers here. And just beginning to think that out. So I'd be interested to know what you think about that. I think as a curator, she's an amazingly interesting curator. The show that she organized for here, Photogenetic, is one of the I think it's, I don't know whether, it seems to me one of the most interesting early exhibitions of archival art. I mean, archival art becomes, very celebrated at the turn of the 21st century. You get people like Hal Foster, etc., loads of books on the archive. And yet here it is, quietly introduced at street level in 1995. It's an exhibition about artists who rethink the archives of colonial photography, the archives of family photography, the archives of family photography, personal photography. And she writes this curatorial statement saying that she's interested in artists who use photographic sources and mediums to explore a range of issues around the colonial past and the use of photographic evidence to inscribe history. So she's got a really interesting cross-section of people. People you can see on the screen are Angela Samba from the Netherlands, Deborah Robinson and Betty Saar on the one on the right-hand side. Behind is a painting by Robin Kaukiwa, it's a New Zealand artist whose work she brought over, Fiona Foley. So very, very interesting selection of artists, very global in her thinking. The other thing I think is that when I begin to write about her work now, what I think is interesting is that if we take somebody like Maud's work, we can begin to rethink the 90s. The 90s are so often put across to us as the decade of globalization, the decade of the Biennale, the decade of the world global economy and art. And there are just so many accounts, with things like the Biennale reader confirming this is our account of the 90s. And I began to wonder about that, and I began to think about what if you took a different set of accounts about globalization in the 90s, which was kind of coming out of photogenetic, about the way that there are, crossings between women of color about the question of practice and representation? What if you begin to rethink the 90s in these terms, and you begin to think about the way that histories of that period intersect with her ideas about histories of European modernism, that we might be able to retell another story? And I just wrote an essay which was published a few months ago, where I'm trying to argue for a different history of the 90s based on a different account of photographic practice and curatorial practice, which isn't about the mainstream narratives of globalization. Maud Sulter was passionately interested too in those who had been lost and forgotten. So she's always interested in these narratives that are the counter-narratives, the alternative stories, the things that we don't know, the people that we haven't figured out. And I would just like to look just a little bit at take that strand in her work, that she's very, very much interested in this question of the disappeared. And just to kind of cluster a few of her works around this notion, as she said, of the disappeared. This whole notion of the disappeared, I think, is something that runs through my work. I'm very interested in absence and presence, in the way that particularly black women's experience and black women's contribution to culture is so often erased and marginalized. So that it's important for me as an individual, and obviously as a black woman artist, to put black women back in the center of the frame, both literally within the photographic image, but also in the cultural institutions where our work operates. And when her work went into the V&A, she was interviewed by Mark Hayworth Booth, the curator who bought her work, and there used to be, up on the V&A website, a lot more information about her work and statements by her. So the theme of the disappeared and the disappearance has a certain irony in that we're rethinking now about bringing her back into perspective. And the theme runs right through her work. These are early works that she did, early, mid-80s, and she was fascinated by and preoccupied by and very worried by the disappearance of black children. And she made a very interesting series of collages thinking around these issues, thinking around stereotyping, thinking about the lack of concern in metropolitan centres, London and Birmingham, that children were just disappearing, missing children. She produced a series, this is her first major series of work, as a big, large-scale format photography series, Sphinx. Top left, you can just see Maud herself at an event. This is Maud then, the group of women doing a poetry reading at one of the showings. Top right is what it looked like installed, and a couple of examples. So a big series of 9 photographs taken off the west coast of Africa, and she wanted to think about the way that landscape and water record histories of communities who've disappeared. It's taken at St. James Island, which was a slave port by the British, a fortified slave port. She goes out into the sea to photograph the landscape looking back. So it's also, I think, it's a question of the photograph as a meditation on lost histories, on people whose histories and presence have almost disappeared. And yet, as she says, she writes at the time that you can be walking on the beach and still find maybe a bead that had still been dropped all those centuries ago, when people who had been imprisoned in the fort and then had been shipped for the sort of very, very traumatic and often fatal passage to the Americas and to the Caribbean. So it's a way in which landscape and water act as enduring witnesses, and it's a very powerful work. And it's something I think, again, I think about legacies, about artists who've taken that theme and I just went to Liège last week to see this water art walk, which has just been curated around the city of Liège. And it's shown this now iconic work by Navjot Altaf, a sort of wonderful video piece about the impossibility of testimony after the 2002 Hindu-Muslim conflict in Gujarat. It's called Lacuna in Testimony because when Navjot Altaf went to meet survivors of that conflict, people found it very difficult to speak, to remember what had happened. So she makes this video around the difficulty of memory, the problematic of memory, the problematic of testimony. And it made me kind of go back again. When I'd seen that piece, I went back to think about Sphinx, and I thought there's this thematic of artists thinking about memory, testimony, and water. And so I'm thinking about, you know, the ways that Maud's work speaks forward and that connects with contemporary practice. Also, Maud became very interested in individuals. If Sphinx was about lost communities, families, groups, women, men, children who had been lost through slavery, then she became also fascinated by individual women whose history had been hidden from history and lost from history, despite the white feminist project to bring the women hidden from history back again. What she was finding was that, it wasn't coming back enough. So she produced an amazing series. This is Hysteria, 1991, shown at street level. I think probably the following year, 1992, about Edmonia Lewis, African, Native American, American sculptor, who left America to work in Rome in the 1850s. And Sulter takes the role of Hysteria, Edmonia Lewis herself. There's a massive marble slab and a huge range of different photographs suggesting friendship circles, the 19th century studio practice, and the gallery, the photographs, the marble. She wrote a film script. She commissioned music for a CD. All of this creates this narrative that here is Edmonia Lewis, the center of attention of visitors, friends, lovers, models, the art world, and then suddenly the main protagonist apparently disappears. This is the story of Edmonia Lewis. But of course, Edmonia Lewis doesn't disappear, does she? Because Edmonia always knows where Edmonia is. You know, she's only disappeared to the art world. And I think it's this whole purpose that Maud's trying to show, that recorded history may record that somebody has disappeared. But what does that disappearance mean? And what does it say, not about the person, but about the making of the archive, the politics of history that will let somebody disappear from history, memory, and the archive? In Alba, she's really interested in a black woman who was, according to the poetry of William Dunbar, at the court of James IV of Scotland. So she creates this amazing, again, multimedia artwork to try and summon this woman into being. And so you go around the gallery with this amazing, this is at Preston, I'm showing it installed at Preston with these amazing red walls. And you're listening as you move from room to Maud reading her poetry. She had, those of you who knew Maud, she had a really, really distinctive voice. So you hear this poetry, you hear the music, you hear the sound. She's trying to conjure up a woman who's only known through references in poetry. And again, this passionate belief in the long-standing history of black women in European history. It was shown alongside a video plantation, and I'm just showing the CCA original installation and the recurated, the monitor of it's being recurated. And again, here again, she's interestingly focused on another woman who's been missed out of the story, as it were, in white feminism, and that's Antoinette Mason, who's the woman, the mad woman in the attic. to quote the famous feminist book, in Jane Eyre. And it's a really extraordinary video piece in which Maud herself had reconstructive abdominal surgery. And so you see this surgery, which was videoed by the surgeon's team. And into that, she's intercut stills from Orson Welles' famous film, Jane Eyre. And Maud is reading poetry. She's also voicing other poets like Gertrude Stein. So it's an amazing, it's quite a long piece, about 40 minutes. It's quite a difficult piece to watch. And I can remember at one point Maud sent my partner and I this. She said, "Here's a video of my new work," and it was the uncut version without the Orson Welles, just the abdominal surgery version. And we thought, "Oh yeah, new work from Maud. Let's put it on." Oh, yes. So, the amazing bravery, the incredible courage to have that surgery. She sought out this amazing, very, very avant-garde surgeon in Burbank, California, had the surgery, had the film, and then made work out of it. There's amazing, I think, amazing courage here. The other thing is that not only is this about trying to conjure women who have been absent from history, to bring them back into the past, but she's not interested in historical reconstruction. She knows the fallibility of the archive. And this motif, I think, in Plantation, of stitching and cutting and suturing and remaking and taking things out and putting things together, is very much a kind of working practice for her, that she's thinking through the difficulties of reconstruction, literally on the body, in the body. And she becomes, I think, therefore, very interested in installation, where she can reassemble all sorts of things, and in photomontage. And this is just, oops, sorry. Oh, sorry. And in her photomontage, she's moved to an imaginary figure. So this is a photomontage circus. And the protagonist is Monique, who is never depicted. So she's gone from making works about real people, historical figures like Edmonia Lewis, poetic figures in Alba, and imaginary figures. And it's really, really interesting. She writes a short prose poem to explain that Monique is the protagonist. She's born in Cameroon, and she lives in Europe through the fascism period of the 1930s and 40s. And she writes about how Monique and her family have lives which are jeopardized by racism, by fascism, by ethnic cleansing. And she concludes this by saying, Blood Money, the prose poem ends with the reminder, Monique may be near you now. And we know how in fortress Europe of today, the cost of migration, that this kind of racial abuse, racial persecution hasn't gone away. And Maud really wanted to say the past is important because it reminds us of the urgency of the project now, as well as the kind of long-standing cross-cultural contact and conflict that have shaped the world we live in. So I think there's the longevity, legacy aspect of her work. She had the future in sight. She wasn't going back to the past just for dusty archives. She had a very, very strong idea about that. And the other figure who she became very, very preoccupied with is Jean Duval. You probably know Jean Duval is best known as the muse of Baudelaire. And she saw this photograph, supposedly taken by Félix Nadar, of an unknown woman. And as she says, there she stared at me, willing me to give her a name, an identity, a voice. So for over a decade, I have been image making with Jean Duval in mind, from Calliope to Sahabat. And she was really, really fascinated. She made a lot of different work about Jean Duval, Calliope, as she said, Calliope, Duval et Dumas. She constantly returned to this. This is a great series that she showed in Edinburgh in 2002, Jeanne, a melodrama. And her last works, this is La Chevelure, again returning to the idea of Jean Duval, returning to Baudelaire's poetry, and thinking through again, what does it mean to be Jean Duval? So she loves creating, performing, thinking through what the portrait, the self-portrait can be, who is depicted. Is it Maud Sulter? Is it Jean Duval? And how do you depict, how do you bring to the portrait a sense of the longevity of a relationship, the longevity of a contact between Europe, Africa, the Caribbean over centuries. So there's a lot going on in these works. I'm not just going to introduce you to them. I'll just conclude maybe by saying a little bit about the exhibition that we're planning for 2015. It's a partnership, as I've said, between Street Level, Autograph ABP, two curators, me and the photographer who many of you will be familiar with his work, Ajamu, I think, who's been showing a lot here and has some work on at the African Caribbean Centre here in Osborne Street at the moment. It's a very, very nice partnership of four of us working together. We're also working with the photographer Ingrid Pollard, who's one of our consultants to the project, and with another black photographer, Marcia Michael, who's our project research assistant. And at this stage, we've been fortunate we have funding from Arts Council England and a number of different partners. So the exhibition's underway. But it is a huge challenge. How do you condense the life, the amazing energy, the sheer quantity of work that I've just touched on into an exhibition? Yes, I mean, we're all familiar with the great retrospectives of Rembrandt or Titian, but we want, again, to create something that's living, that's alive, that's vibrant, that's not the dusty museum. So we have a big challenge. We have a challenge in that Maud was a curator. She was a beautiful curator, impeccable, finicky to the very last detail. So we've also got that challenge. So there's a lot that we have to do to curate this work. She also, as I said, born in Glasgow. She has long traditions of contact. She showed a lot of her major pieces here at Street Level, showed her work across Scotland. This is one of the last exhibitions that one of the later exhibitions she curated, 2002 at the Glasgow School of Art. On the right is Maud opening it with, some of you may have also known Eileen Yeo, who used to be Professor of History at Strathclyde, who organised with Maud, a kind of big series called Gender and Power, series of symposia at Strathclyde. And Maud showed her own work and the work of another artist, Lubena Hamid. So there's so many different points of contact here. As I said too, that in her later years, she took up these large format Polaroid portraits, and I reckon she probably made about 100 of them. It's a huge number of portraits. Some of them were commissioned for the National Portrait Gallery in London, so that's where some of them are. And she called this her Mario Testino moment. She was so ironic. She had such a great sense of humor. And she photographed, the really interesting thing is, she photographed at the turn of the millennium most of the leading figures in the arts and cultural and literary worlds of Scotland. From arts administrators and curators like Timothy Clifford or Tessa Jackson, festival directors, poets and writers. Now, we know who some of them are, so I put up a few mugshots to ask, do any of you know who these lot are? Because we don't. And we would really, really like to know if you know who they are, because we'd really like to be in. One of the things that we thought would be really nice to do is maybe to have a couple of portraits and then to get Ajamu to re-photograph people today and make a short film about what it's like having your portrait photograph taken, or something like that, to try and create a living legacy with these, to try and think about the format she's using. They're all she has a very particular idea about what a portrait photograph is, and I think that's interesting too. So, I mean, I know some of you are practitioners here, and I'd be interested to talk with you about what you think about this. And I just finished with the work in the Scottish Parliament collection. It's a self-portrait, which is so characteristic of her work. It's large format Polaroid. There's Maud with her Aqua Bar doll and a close friend, Miles Danso, who she commissioned at least 3 or 4 CDs from, so collaborated with them. She calls this work a playful portrait, a trope of continuing 500-year exchange between Africa and Europe. And that's so characteristic. This is her kind of persistent theme, the crossovers between her identity, as she called it, of Glaswegian, Ghanaian. These, I think, are the legacies that she's left to us, an extraordinary body of work in writing, curating, and in art. It's an outstanding creative legacy, a huge body of artwork, and I think it's kind of up to us now to reap the benefits of that creative legacy, so I hope that you will help us do it. Thanks very much.